Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you to everyone online, and especially those of you who braved the rain to be here in person. It definitely seems like the right kind of dark and stormy night to be talking about horror films. I think we got the mood right. But honestly, when it comes to London, I think every day is a really good day to talk about horror films because the two are so intertwined. This city has appeared in more than 145 horror films already, more than any other European city. And it continues to inspire films of terror, haunting, unease, or even apocalyptic disaster. There have been horror films set in this city every decade since the silent era. And whether it's the ancient houses, the fog-laden parks, even the quaint village-like boroughs, directors and filmmakers come back here again and again, drawing on the legends, the histories, the architecture, and even the living energy of this amazing city. In researching my book, Deathlines, one of the things I found most remarkable about London was the ability the city seemed to have to adapt and evolve. There isn't just one kind of London horror. In fact, I originally tried to fit 20 walks into this book, but it would have been this big and far too heavy. So I had to narrow it down to 8, and there are several little one-off spots as well, because I just couldn't resist. For tonight, though, we don't have to walk the city. So I'm going to take you on a best of tour. Some of the chances to hop around and see the most popular places that have inspired and intrigued horror filmmakers. We'll go over a century of horror cinema, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of films you know, but I should warn that there probably will be spoilers. I'm hoping, though, that not only will I keep them to a minimum, but that they might inspire you to watch the films that you haven't seen, or maybe look at the ones that you already know in a new light. So allow me to sort of guide you into the ways that London's influenced the plot, the storyline of films, as well as the ways in which horror films have twisted and reimagined this city's dark dreams and histories. And of course, I'm very happy to chat about any films that I wasn't able to fit in here in the questions after. But let's begin by going back before horror cinema. And that's because long before John Logie Baird ever invented the cinematic camera, London was one of the hearts of horror. And that's thanks to the Gothic novel. London regularly appeared in the background and even in the emerging stands of the 19th century. One of the first Gothic novels, Castle of Otranto, was written in the suburbs of London, Strawberry Hill. The first vampire story, Das Vampire by John William Polidori, begins and ends in London. And of course, there are many Gothic novels set in whole or in part here, and many of our most infamous Gothic villains were based in or came to London, all of which inspired horror films. This is the home of Dracula. In the book, his aim was to come here because it was the capital of a vast empire. It gave him the opportunity to spread his sort of venom, as it were, all over the world. And ever since, films from every decade, including the ones you see here, brought various iterations of that vampire to the capital, making Dracula in London truly immortal. Sweeney Todd, of course, is a Londoner. It's a penny dreadful story that was written in London and about London. He sets up shop on Fleet Street, right in the heart of the city. Dorian Gray lived and loved here, and indeed his notorious portrait was painted here. On film, he's walked the King's Road during the swinging 60s, as well as seen Wilton's Music Hall. In London also became the home of Jekyll and Hyde, curiously through Jack the Ripper. Now, Robert Louis Stevenson's novel does not specifically name the city in which he's in, and many of the streets are in his native Edinburgh. So there was an assumption originally that he was writing about home. But about 2 years after the novel's debut in 1888, the book had been turned into a play, and it managed to get a 10-week run in London. Unfortunately, this overlapped with the Ripper murders that August, and it had a very serious impact on the play, as well as its lead actor. So one of the key features of the play was a transformation that was made on stage by the lead character, Richard Mansfield, into Hyde. And they did this through a remarkable combination of lighting and makeup. So he had several different layers of makeup that responded to different lights, and the lighting on stage would change, and that's what made it look like his face was actually transforming. This, in combination with Mansfield's really terrifying and brutal portrayal of Hyde, made the audience believe he might actually be Jack the Ripper. They accosted him at the stage doors. Several people gave his name to the police. It caused the show to shut down. And of course, it meant as well that the Hyde and Ripper stories ended up being intertwined, firmly placing this villain in London. And there are many different stories that cross over these two. My favorite I've added to this slide, which is Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde in the upper right, but there are other examples. And even in the most recent iterations, like Hyde being Russell Crowe in the 2017 The Mummy, place the villain in London. Now, these Gothic novels, and honestly the Ripper lore as well, had a strong influence on London horror from the start. Filmmakers created a very recognizable, often reproduced visual tableau of what was called Gothic London. And that's a term that Christopher Frayling writes about, if you're familiar with him, all across the genres, not just horror. But in horror, it really stood strong, particularly in the East End. And this Gothic London was defined by only three features: fog, gas lamps, and cobbled streets. I think you can see the example of how enduring this is in the Lodger series of films. You've got the two on the upper left are two examples, one from the 20s, one from the 40s, but there were 5 remakes of the Lodger. It was based on a book by Mary Belloc Lowndes, and she herself was inspired by the Ripper murders. And in each of these films, there's very much always this image of the man coming in from the fog, and that's his sense of eeriness and unknown. And of course, there is plenty of gas lamps and cobbled streets, even though these films weren't being filmed in the Victorian era, they were contemporary films. And so you get this sense of London through very minimal sort of the details, and that's really practical. All of these were filmed on set. And so that's why they needed this shorthand. But the visual of Gothic London has become so well known that few films actually needed to be set in London in order to reproduce it. And at the bottom, I've got a few examples of this. So on the far left, you have the German film, Jack the Ripper. This was filmed largely in Germany. They didn't have a permit to film in London, so they sent a guy over with a little camera, and he does a few establishing shots in what looks like shaky cam, but it was unintentionally that. But the rest of it was actually filmed on sets or in the streets in Germany. So to make London, they had 6 fog machines, and they created London. On the far right, of course, from Hell's a more recent example, the vast majority of it was shot in Budapest. Of course, there were establishing shots, but the image you see on screen are the streets of Budapest. But it makes it feel like London, having that gas lamp and that little haze. My favorite example, though, is probably in the middle, Edge of Sanity. If you haven't seen it, it's a 1980s film that's a Ripper Hyde crossover, and it's a very much film of its time. So it splits not only the character into Hyde and Jekyll, but the film. Jekyll is very much in traditional Victorian London, the costumes, the sets, but Hyde is in this very contemporary 80s, almost surreal world done on stage sets with contemporary clothing, and that's the stills you can see here. But despite this very stylized, very modern idea, they still use versions of this Gothic London. You don't see the actual gas lamp, but you can see on here that you have the gobo showing the shadow of the gas lamp. Instead of the cobbled streets, he's always with this brick backdrop. And of course, there is plenty of fog in other parts of the film. This idea and these films undoubtedly form a large part of the history and the fame of London horror. But what I was most drawn to in my walks is that London is so much more than this Gothic backdrop. And even from the beginning, various spaces and buildings took on personalities of their own. From the start, the possibilities of the Thames were spotted by directors and filmmakers. The river's a defining feature of our city. All you need to know is to see the first bit of EastEnders. But in horror, the Thames can also be a powerful entity. It can affect the plot and character of films. You can argue it began with this film, the 1939 Dark Eyes of London. This story revolves around Bela Lugosi's Dr. Orloff, who uses the Thames to cover up his murderous insurance scams. So Orloff is an optician, and he convinces his most isolated patients, the ones who don't seem to have any family or friends, to take out insurance, naming him as the beneficiary. He claims they can sort of basically get loans off the back of this insurance to help with their health care. But then he proceeds to drown them. And with the help of his accomplice, Jake, he then throws the bodies into the river to make it look like an accident or possibly suicide. The film begins with the image in the upper right of one such victim floating in the Thames. This opening shot at the time horrified the National Motion Picture League in America. It delayed coming out of the film, and it contributed to its H certificate rating. If you're not familiar, the H certificate was developed for horror films. It's the precursor to the X certificate. The Thames is crucial to Orloff's plot. It allows him to cover up his murders. That is until he signs up one client who has an estranged daughter. The daughter arrives from America, and she insists that the police investigate properly. She refuses to accept what's happened. And when they do, they discover that the water in the lungs of the drowned man was too clean to have come from the Thames. Isn't that great? It's a solid joke, but it's also a really important plot point, because once they realize it has to be murder, the obvious suspect is Dr. Orloff. But the police don't get him in the end. The river does. He ends up fighting with his accomplice, Jake. You can see us still in the upper left. And Jake pushes him into the river where he drowns. And you get that shot of Bela Lugosi there in the bottom. The irony of the Thames, as both his accomplice and his killer, really helped cement the idea of the Thames as a potential character or plot point in London horror. And it has an enduring legacy. As you can see from this slide, many other horror films have their villains throw victims into the Thames. They themselves leap into the Thames. And even on occasion, some people get saved by the Thames. One director who particularly liked this was Alfred Hitchcock. He tried to have a scene of a body being put into the Thames in his 27 The Lodger, but the film censors wouldn't have it. So by the time he came back in '73 to make his next London film, he was able to do this really well in the opening of Frenzy, where you see the shot that's on the left. That woman's body floats along the Thames just as a government official is announcing that the river is now cleaner than ever. It's a pot shot at the government, and it's a very sort of dramatic shot. In fact, he loved the visual so much that in order to sort of drum up interest in the film, he had a body cast made of himself and floated it on the Thames. And that's the image you can see there. It's a newspaper photograph of the cast. It's really well done. But that image was so sort of embedded in the culture by the 70s that people enjoyed it when they saw the body in the Thames. There wasn't a sort of sudden worry that Alfred Hitchcock had been killed. So another thing that's great about that Frenzy opening is that when you pan up from the body, the Houses of Parliament are in the background, and he's obviously makes comments about the government throughout the film. Naturally, Westminster is a great spot for horror filmmakers. It's a chance that they can imagine the nightmarish outcomes of a government that's failing its citizens, either through corruption, ineptitude, or just being unequal to the challenge. The corrupt government is at the heart of this film, 1979 Holmes Ripper crossover, Murder by Decree. The film concludes that Jack the Ripper's murders in Whitechapel were the result of a royal cover-up. Holmes discovers that Queen Victoria's son, Prince Albert, has had an affair with a Catholic prostitute and produced a working-class Catholic heir. Unwilling to accept what they see as a degradation, the crown, as well as the ministers, get together and decide they need to hide the child and murder all of the witnesses, and that's the Ripper murders. The plot was based on Stephen Knight's '76 nonfiction book, Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution, in which Knight hypothesized that the Ripper murders were linked to Prince Albert, essentially as is laid out in the film. And though the crime is ultimately tied to the crown, this film really focuses its energy on the ministers who were involved, the prime minister as well as two of the others. At the climax of the film, Holmes is called to a secret meeting in Westminster to try and ensure his silence. And those are the images you can see up here. As you can see, it's set up for intimidation. They're surrounding him in that lower left image. They're even on raised pulpits. Holmes knows he can't do anything. He doesn't have the evidence to convict them, and he admits that. But despite this, he gives a very powerful, searing speech where he challenges the government's right to let their people die in the name of pride. At the time this film came out, that speech had a very real resonance for the people of Britain. They'd endured years of inflation, economic decline, and debilitating strikes. You probably have a lot of sympathy. It felt for many of them like the government was either ignoring the problem or actively doing things and making decisions that were hurting its people. The film made the true horror of the Rippers not the brutality of the murder, but the way in which the government was actively hurting its own people. It was a contemporary message, and of course, Westminster was the perfect background for it. Of course, Knight's conspiracy theory also inspired Alan Moore's graphic novel From Hell, of which a film was made in 2001. In this film, we get a scene actually inside Buckingham Palace. That's what you can see on the lower right, where the Queen is discussing with her physician the need to get rid of the Prince Albert situation. Though later the Queen's horrified by how far Dr. Gull has taken it, the blame is clearly laid at the feet of the monarchy alongside Dr. Gull and the Masonic Brotherhood. So the idea here is still people in power, but it's different ways and reasons they would be in power. It's sort of the people pulling the strings in the background, and they're harming the citizens. And so it's really interesting to think that 30 years on from Murder by Decree, the same basic inspiration of Stephen Knight could be focusing on the different aspects, the ministry versus the monarchy, and this idea of the Masonic Brotherhood. There's an equally compelling and terrifying strain of horror in which officials and the military are doing the best they can to protect the city and ultimately failing. You might immediately think of 28 Days Later or Day of the Triffids, where scenes of the empty city and Westminster in particular show how far the government has already failed and how quickly. However, I think that there's perhaps a bit more humor and certainly a lot more disaster in the monster movies of the 1960s. Now, in each of these movies, you have examples of the government completely failing its people because you have giant monsters who've managed to get into the heart of the city completely unharmed. Eugene Laurier ended up doing 2 films. In that upper right, Behemoth the Sea Monster, he has these great shots of Parliament perpetually in the background in the climax of the film, while the giant lizard monster attacks people. And so it's to give the sense that the government's sort of just looking on helplessly. In Conga, with John Lamont directed, in the lower right, you actually have a face-off between the monster and the military in front of the Houses of Parliament, where they fire at the monster and more bullets hit the Houses of Parliament than do the monkey. You can kind of see above the Conga's hand, there's some explosions on the facade. But I think the 1960s Godzilla-inspired Gorgo has the most dramatic Parliament scene. In the film, a lizard is captured off the coast of Ireland and put into a circus under the name Gorgo. Unfortunately, what they think is a giant is actually just a little baby, and its very angry mother decides it needs to get its kid back. And that's the lizard you can see in the picture. They do everything they can to try and keep her out, and she manages to destroy Tower Bridge. She walks all over Piccadilly. She gets finally to the Houses of Parliament, and they're at their wits' end, so they bring out the big guns. They have a giant missile. They set up a blockade, and it does cause the lizard to pause. They fire their missile. It goes right over her shoulder, and as you can see, straight through the clock face of Big Ben. This monumental destruction is entirely the government's fault, and it shows how really incapable they are, as well as a little bit of humor, because you're essentially watching them destroy themselves. Now, of course, we might expect a lot of horror around Westminster or bodies in the Thames, but one of the things that I found most intriguing were the unexpected areas that seem to be popular for horror films. For example, right outside our doorstep in the nearby area of Holland Park is home to a handful of horror movies that relies on the leafy streets and seeming idyllic qualities of this area. One of the films set here, Full Circle, or The Haunting of Julia in the US, stars Mia Farrow as Julia. She moves to a house bordering Holland Park after the accidental death of her daughter, Katie. She's essentially throwing her old life and marriage away in the hopes of a fresh start. But the house she's chosen has a tragic history of its own, and odd occurrences lead Julia to host a seance in her living room, and that's the still in the upper right. Once the room is darkened, the atmosphere starts to get very creepy, and then all of a sudden, the medium, Miss Flood, starts to panic. She begins hyperventilating. It upsets absolutely everyone in the circle. They're racing to get her water to try and help. And while Julia takes her to the sofa to sit down, she whispers to Julia that she has to leave the house or she'll die. Now, Julia actually doesn't decide to do this. It does transpire that her house is haunted by a young girl who died there, but the ghost looks eerily similar to Julia's daughter, and that's the image you can see in the lower right. So she instead decides she wants to become entangled in the ghost to try and help it. Of course, the first glimpse is actually not in her house, it's in nearby Holland Park. After she meets her sister-in-law at the Holland Park Cafe, still is on the lower left, Julia walks by passing a girls' school on the way home, and her eye falls on a sort of long, waterfall-y blonde hair, and she immediately thinks it's Katie, but in a blink, it's gone. It's the very first sighting of the ghost, but later she goes to the children's play area trying to take some photos, and she sees this same girl playing in the sand. When again she seems to leave, Julia goes to investigate, and she digs up a dead squirrel and a sharp file, and that's the shot you can see in the upper left. She's horrified, she screams, really upsetting the children, and it even shows us that early on she knows there's something not quite right with her ghost, and yet she continues to try and draw this relationship with it. I won't ruin the end for you, you'll have to watch it. However, it's the coziness of these areas, the child's playground or the beautiful home, that I really want to draw attention to, because it makes the scenes eerie and unsettling for that sense of safety she's trying to create. And it's a recurring theme of the area. The beauty or comfort of it, the world or that they've developed, hides deeply troubled people, often with a very haunted past. Another example is another Mia Farrow disturbed family story, Secret Ceremony, in the upper left, and that's shot at the Peacock House, a brilliantly colored mansion on the east of Holland Park. If you don't know it, it was built for Ernest Debenham, so that Italianate architecture you can kind of see in the background is really fantastically and expensively done. And it's the luxury of the house that is this perfect facade. Even in this scene, it looks like a happy family. But behind closed doors, these two grieving women start to essentially decay one another. They begin to feel trapped by each other and have developed for themselves a sort of codependency that ultimately ends up costing one of them quite a lot. Another, the 1978 Argento-inspired Terror, has an actress who's boarding at a hostel in Holland Park, surrounded by murders that are instigated by the ghost of a witch who put a curse on her family. In this instance, the past is very much invading the present, but over the course of centuries. And what seems like a very friendly, warm actress's hostel starts to literally drip blood. Chelsea's King's Road, sorry, I've skipped something. So the other thing in the area is actually Notting Hill. So the nearby Notting Hill also has a sense of this haunting, this past and the present through this film, Quatermass and the Pit. This is the third in Hammer's Quatermass trilogy. It's based on the TV serial of the same name. A crew expanding the underground comes across a mysterious object that the government thinks might be related to the recent Nazi bombing, and which Professor Quatermass discovers is an ancient Martian ship. And you can see it in the upper left, the military cleaning off that ship. Now, even though it crashed thousands of years ago, ever since then, that ship seems to be giving off a sort of evil presence, which manifested for centuries in terms of like ghosts and poltergeists. We learned that the fictional name of the station, Hobbs End, is named for those demonic activities. Hob, we're told, used to be a name for the devil. Alongside these menacing visions, Quatermass also learns that the people of Earth have been evolving for centuries out of what was essentially a Martian ethnic purity program. They came to Earth in order to breed an ideal version of their species, but for one reason or another, we don't find out, abandoned it. Now, even though there's been this long length of time for us to evolve, that Martian drive for genetic purity still dwells in the British DNA. And at the climax of the film, it's awakened in the form of a mind control where the population seeks out anyone who's genetically different, and you know that because they aren't under the mind control, and kills them. There's obvious Nazi sentiment to this and reflection on World War II, but as well, it's also about the location. Hobbs End is fictional, but its nearest equivalent on the Central Line is Notting Hill Gate Station. And Nigel Neal, who wrote the TV series, was inspired by recent cultural activity in that area, the Notting Hill riots. If you aren't familiar, it was a massive unrest in Notting Hill that sparked from an attack on an interracial couple. In the film, they give a Notting Hill postcode to the area, and that way the climactic scenes of violence and the reason for them are evocative of these riots. Even more so, director Roy Ward Baker was known at that time for having directed Flame in the Streets, a documentary on these riots. So there was already going into the film an association there. And he said that it was a contribution to the vivid scenes of chaos at the end. And you can see us still on the lower right. These are quite dramatic riots that happen in the film. Quatermass in the Pit is only one example, though, of the cultural shifts in the 60s influencing horror films. In particular, the counterculture was one such movement. And the time of youthful rebellion in the swinging 60s and the drive for social change inspired the horror industries with focuses on Soho and Chelsea. Chelsea's King's Road, in particular, is heavily tied to the swinging 60s, with 8 horror movies set in the area, all filmed between 1966 and 1976. In these films, the counterculture does take center stage, but in order to critique the values and morals of youth culture, they're really drawing on the tension between the generations. And one of the most direct confrontations is in this film, Dracula AD 1972. A group of 20-somethings led by Johnny Alucard, which, spoiler alert, is Dracula backwards, decides to raise Dracula from the dead in a nearby Chelsea church. This act alone was drawing on cultural fears at the time. It associates occult fear with the younger swinging 60s generation. And that was already in the ambiance of the world at the time in the 70s, thanks to things like the Highgate vampire scandal. That's quite a big story, so I'm happy to talk about that afterwards if you fancy. But then once awakened, it turns out that Dracula can't leave the church. So instead, he has to rely on Alucard to bring him in his victims. And that means that the main villain of this film, the one we see preying on people, the one we see being violent, isn't the Victorian Dracula, but a young hipster man in black. And that's the one on the upper right, Alucard. The one who can save these young people and the world is Dr. Van Helsing, played by the 60-something Peter Cushing, and that's the image below. He does so using Victorian methods. He's drawing on his grandfather's notebooks, as well as a bit of old world charm. He's a symbol of continuity with the past, but also the conservative moral center of the film. He is the heroic older generation, swooping in to save the foolhardy, dangerous flower children. And that battle of generations couldn't be made more clear than when he actually physically fights Alucard, an actor and a character 30 years his junior. You can even see, I think, in these photographs, Alucard's also much more physically fit gentleman. Of course, Van Helsing wins, and he goes on to save his granddaughter and all of London. One can't help but think there is obviously a certain generational animosity at the time, but it was probably a message close to Hammer's heart. The production company of this film, Hammer, had been very well known for its old-fashioned good versus evil horrors that by the 70s just weren't doing well at the box office. They were really struggling to compete with younger directors and newer ideas. So when Van Helsing manages to get the better of this much younger, new, fresh-faced actor, you can't help but feel Hammer's working through a fantasy of their own. There is, though, a similar antagonism towards youth culture in one of my favorite Chelsea films, Michael Reeves' The Sorcerers. It's a scorching critique of the 60s counterculture done from within, as Reeves, who you probably know for doing The Witchfinder General, is a member of the generation he's so vividly critiquing. The titular sorcerers are two pensioners, Marcus and Estelle Montserrat, and they discover a way to manipulate and experience the body of someone else using a psychedelic hypnosis machine. And that's what you can see in the upper left. Naturally, they want someone younger. You'd want to experience that sensation of youth and ease again. But in order to lure someone into this unhinged experiment, they decide that what they need is someone seeking, quote, ecstasy with no consequence. In other words, one of the young, jaded youths that crowd the King's Road. In fact, ecstasy with no consequence is what they use to convince the young nihilistic Mike to come with him. He's the gentleman you can see in all of the film, the stills. In the upper right, he's in the center with his friends at a club and his girlfriend. And as you can even see in this photo, he's basically making fun of them, talking about how boring everything is. He has a complete disinterest in all of the things that he seems to have in his life. Once they've lured him in, the process does work, and at first, Marcus and Estelle are overjoyed by the tiny sensations that he takes for granted, that is, Mike takes for granted. They love touch. He's holding an egg, and they talk about how they don't feel arthritis as they're touching it. They go for a swim, and it's been so long since they've been able to move with that freedom. All of these little wonderful pleasures that certainly we know Mike takes for granted and doesn't enjoy. But things turn really dark when Estelle starts to become almost addicted to the sensations that she can create. She really wants ultimately to have everything, and that pushes them towards their deaths. In the end, it's the pursuit of that ecstasy that has very deadly consequences. This bleak vision of voracious pleasure seeking is intimately tied with the area, pointing to the counterculture of King's Road as a literal dead end. Now, as I mentioned, the other place that was popular for capturing youth culture, though more in the mid-70s, was Soho. Carnaby Street and the clubs offered the bohemian glamour, fashion, and feel of the era. And unlike Chelsea, here there was a lot more sort of joy and very rarely critiquing youth culture. For example, in Night After Night After Night, a young man who hangs out in Soho becomes a suspect in a series of murders. But the film is ultimately on his side. Though there's a reason for the police to question him, one of the girls he's dating is one of the victims, the police are constantly referring to him and even bullying him for his shaggy hair and his leather jacket. Their ageism is a bit of a joke, and it's proved wrong when in the end, the murderer is a member of the establishment, a judge who's unable to face the liberation of women and loosening of morals as it causes him to crack. Soho's association with pleasure and sexual liberty is also alluded to on a trip to a blue movie theater in American Werewolf in London. I see lots of smiles. It's a great scene. So it's not just the red lights of Soho that make this a very clever film location. John Landis has chosen one of the busiest intersections of the city, and then he makes the most of it. At this point in the film, for those who haven't seen it, American tourist David knows he turns into a werewolf, but has learned that all of his victims' souls will sort of follow him around forever unless he dies. He gets to the point of almost killing himself, and he can't face it. And so really distraught and unsure what to do, he goes into the Skinflick cinema you see on the left. See you next Wednesday. While he's in there, he transforms into a wolf again, and he attacks another person watching as well as the attendant. And the police come and barricade it from the outside. And you can see that in the photo on the left, the police barricade. Now, this actually has the opposite effect you'd hope. It causes the crowd to become interested, and they start to form sort of en masse. And just as they meet the critical point of people sort of flooding out into the streets, where David breaks through the metal doors, leaps through the crowd, and decapitates the officer at the center, and then runs off. It's the crowds of Piccadilly that make the scene difficult from there. The bus swerves to miss the werewolf. People are fleeing the scene and away from the dead body, so they run into traffic. They fall under the crowd. They get trampled. They're under cars. Cars crash into one another, into the fountain. We see a body fly through an ATM vestibule. It is utter mayhem. The cacophony of violence is incredible, but it's all due to the crowds and the density of cars in Piccadilly Circus. All the werewolf did was kill one cop. Director John Landis once explained this scene as what goes horribly wrong when a bus swerves to miss a dog. It's an amazing use of the real lived space and a totally understandable fear of the crowd. Nearby Bloomsbury, of course, is another great location for horror, with lots of films inspired by the occult associations of that area. But the most popular building is probably the British Museum, thanks to its long history and association with Egyptian curses. In the Victorian era, there was a great deal of concern over objects brought back from Egypt by British archaeologists. For those interested, there's a fantastic book on this subject. It's Roger Luckhurst's The Mummy's Curse, and he talks about this in great detail. But to summarize, as a form of imperial guilt in the 19th century, people genuinely worried that because they were taking these things from another country's resting place and putting them on display, it might be a sort of degradation or upsetting, and so they would actually have a curse to enact upon the imperial discoverers. Many stories were written about this fear. Perhaps the most famous is Bram Stoker's Jewel of the Seven Stars, which itself inspired a clutch of horror movies, including the ones that you can see above, Blood from the Mummy's Tomb and Tale of the Mummy, and inspired a scene in The Mummy Returns. But the most faithful adaptation is probably the 1980 The Awakening, in which archaeologist Matthew Corbeck, played by Charlton Heston, discovers an unmarked cursed tomb of the evil Queen Kara on the day his daughter is born. 18 years later, after some sleight of hand getting the artifacts out of Egypt and into his office, which is the British Museum, Corbeck becomes obsessed with resurrecting this queen. And that leads him to performing a sacred ritual inside the museum. And that's the shot you can see on the upper right. As you can tell, the museum's exhibition space was essentially trying to recreate the tomb, so it's perfectly laid out for him to do this elaborate ceremony, which is both almost surreal and sacrificial. We see him offer his blood to the mummy, for example. Now, as he's performing this elaborate ritual, from the very back of the museum arrives his daughter, Margaret. Now, at this point in the film, she's supposed to be in a coma. So when she appears, we know something uncanny is happening. But at no point does he even seem to acknowledge it. We watch as she approaches and comes right next to the coffin at the moment he finishes the ceremony. He says the final words, and the mummy collapses into dust. He's furious that this hasn't worked. He's almost put his daughter in the hospital. Well, he literally put his daughter in the hospital trying to make this happen. And he screams at the mummy, but then he looks up and he sees the shot you see in the lower right. Kara has taken over the body of his daughter. What's happened only just dawns on him. You see it in his eyes before Kara kills him. We then cut to that shot in the upper left, the exterior of the British Museum, where Kara opens the door, symbolically unleashing her power all over London. Now, for most of this film, Kara's been a museum exhibition. We even see her in her sort of wrapped up as a mummy. And so you can read this resurrection as part of that Victorian fear of cursed objects. She's its personification. She is an actual Egyptian artifact come to life to avenge herself on her imperial discoverer. But when you look into the horrors of London's past, there's no better place to go than the London Underground. The first film to really make the most of past terrors on the underground was Quatermass in the Pit, which I talked about, that ancient Martian ship coming back to sort of haunt and literally take over us. But one of the most striking is this film, Gary Sherman's thought-provoking cannibal horror Deathline. Now, I'm obviously a fan, my book's named after it, so I'm a little partial, but in this film, a nameless man and woman live hidden in the underground beyond the disused British Museum station. They live very primitively. You can see man in the upper right. They aren't given names. They drink water that's been dripping off the walls. They only can speak the words, mind the doors, because it's the only words that they've ever heard, right? But they also survive on the blood and flesh of wayward individuals. They aren't presented as monsters. They're very morally ambivalent, but an essential part of who they are is that they're relics of the past. A century earlier, workers expanding the underground station became trapped when the tunnel collapsed. Because in the Victorian era, there wasn't a sense of having responsibility for your workers, the company who hired them realized it would cost too much to attempt a rescue, and so left them for dead. Man and woman are the descendants of those workers. With this history, man's hunting journeys onto Russell Square Station can be seen as a violent return of the repressed past, as well as a form of social revenge. I don't want to give too much away about this film, but one of the first victims we see is the man in the upper left, James Manfred with the bowler hat. He is referred to throughout the film constantly by his OBE. They'd specifically spend time trying to build him up as a character. The Detective Calhoun, which Donald Pleasance does brilliantly, even says, this isn't just some Londoner to throw away in a file somewhere. He's the first victim. And when we see Manfred feed his dying wife the blood of that, it's viscerally upsetting, but it also recalls Rousseau's quip that when the poor have nothing else to eat, they'll eat the rich. Now, of course, there are many other films inspired by the unique terror that is the tube. In The Deaths of Ian Stone, the underground is a space for personal revelation for Ian, a man who's killed repeatedly, only to wake up to a new life and new identity, each time being chased by demons. The quick movement of the tube allows him to not be tracked, so it's the one place he can go as long as it's in motion. In Gorgo, which we talked about earlier, many people run to hide in Charing Cross Station as the giant lizard approaches Trafalgar Square. But of course, the weight of the monster on Trafalgar Square causes the tunnel to collapse. In Reign of Fire, a son must return to Tottenham Court Road Station, where his mother died earlier when she uncovered a dragon while they were expanding the underground. And he has to face not only the trauma of his past, but the actual beast that killed his mother. Similarly, in 28 Weeks Later, children Tammy and Andy confront their rage-infected father on the platform of Charing Cross Underground. Earlier, we discovered that he had let their mother die, thinking that he'd abandoned her in a house. And so that moment has quite a lot of emotional layers to it. In Creep, young socialite Kate is trapped also in Charing Cross Underground and pursued by a man who's become warped by an isolated life on the underground. The journey sparks in her great emotional maturity, and the film itself is also a critique of the capitalist individualism. In American Werewolf in London, again, Tottenham Court Road Station becomes a warren of twisted tunnels that leave one commuter desperate to outrun a pursuing werewolf. And finally, in Life Force, the souls of London commuters are sucked from their bodies by soul-sucking space vampires. It's a good movie. One of the great scenes is when this is happening, they cut to Chancery Lane Tube Station, and you get the bodies literally falling and huddling on the platform as their souls leave. And the shot is intentionally designed to look like the etchings that were made of the World War II people hiding during the Blitz, sheltering during the Blitz. Now, whether a tomb, the symbolic buried past, a space for personal revelation, or simply somewhere that you can't escape, the horrors of the underground are varied. They draw on everything from the architecture of the tube to its history and its lived experience. And that brings us back really to where I began, by saying that one of the extraordinary things about London horror is that it offers so much. It can terrorize, unsettle, and shock in turns. As we've seen with its mixture of architectures, its tunnels, the river, there's so much. And it's just as important to say that in these movies, the real cultural fears can be grounded in location. The King's Road evokes the swinging 60s and fears of social change. The notion of governmental failure can be in that single shot in 28 Days Later of Houses of Parliament in the background. The underground is literally and figuratively what lies beneath. Horror in this city is embedded in location in a way unlike anywhere else in the world. That symbolic relationship, I think, grounds horror in a certain reality, especially if you're familiar with the city, but it also gives infinite possibilities for growth. And you can see a hint of where these things head with films like Girl with All the Gifts. One of the central features of this is the BT Tower. Now, I'm not sure how familiar you all are with Soho, but of course, BT Tower isn't the tallest building, but if you're in Soho, anywhere you look, you can see it. And that's because all the buildings surrounding it are shorter than it. In Girl with All the Gifts, there are zombies who are essentially infected by a plant fungus, and when they die, they sprout that plant as a seed pod to be released. All of the zombies that can get to it come to the BT Tower so that the plants can climb to the top. And that means that if those seed pods open, because none of the buildings around them will block it, they have the maximum ability to spread and potentially not only get all of Britain, but even cross the Channel. We see a very different take on the area and even nostalgia specifically with that nightmarish idea of the 60s in Last Night in Soho. Edgar Wright even specifically references some of the 1960s horror films that were made in the area. If you're familiar with Peeping Tom, there's several references to that film in it. And so not only is he drawing on the actual area and its lived history, but its film history as well. So each new film adds a section of layer to the horror and to the appeal of each area. Now, I hope you've been inspired to watch or revisit some of these films here and maybe look the city through fresh, horrific eyes. If you get excited about walking the city about these films, I'd love to point you to my book. It's the first and only book on London horror films. It is a walks book, but I've tried to shove as much information in there as possible so you can also read it when it's raining out. But of course, the thing I'm most excited to get you interested in is watching these movies. So I have on my website, feel free to take a picture of the link, or if you're on the website, a screenshot. I've listed all the movies I've mentioned here with a little summary description so that if you can't remember the title, you can go, oh, what was that cannibal movie she was talking about? Please watch these great films, but of course, I couldn't talk about all of them and I couldn't talk about everything that I love about this topic. So I'm very happy to now open it up to questions online or in person. And thank you so much for listening and letting me take this walk with you.
Okay, so does anybody have a question here in the audience, or are you all being very shy? And I should start with the questions that came through online. Yes, go ahead.
I was just wondering, are you thinking of new cities to explore in this manner, or?
Oh, great. She's asked whether I'm thinking of new cities to explore in this way. Yes, so it will obviously depend on whether people find this interesting or not, but at the moment I'm researching Edinburgh and Glasgow. Thank you.
Should I do one from online?
Sure.
So do you think there's a lot of difference in the way London is portrayed in British and US films? And is it a popular location in horror from other countries?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, it is very popular in other countries. It depends on the time period. There's quite a heavy load of, for example, in the 60s and 70s, Italian directors that come over to London to film in London. There are a handful of German films in the 70s. I alluded to that with Jack the Ripper. There's a lot of American films all throughout that either are filmed on sets in America to pretend that they're London, Or From Hell, for example, is financed by Americans, but it was filmed in Budapest. So it's very popular with other countries. There's also a particularly interesting, more recently phenomena of Japanese horror directors coming to London, more for pieces of films than the whole film. So it is part of that horror discussion. And I think because of its long history, it's a very natural reference for a lot of horror directors. And because I was answering the second half, I forgot what the first half of the question was. I'm so sorry. Would you mind?
It was the difference between the British and US.
Right, the difference between the British and US depictions. Sorry about that. There is and there isn't. I mean, to a certain degree, you of course have this issue of how recognizable London is. Americans tend to lean towards very recognizable locations people would expect, like St. Paul's, like Houses of Parliament. And British directors, they do that as well, but you'll also see more variety. You get films like, for example, Full Circle, which is Holland Park. You get other films that are focused on sort of lesser known areas, maybe neighborhoods that director grew up. But I'd say overall, there is a great interest in a lot of the more iconic areas of London, just because they do play well internationally. So there's still also a lot of crossover. And then, as I said in the beginning, that the Ripper story, it sort of always ends up being the East End. So that becomes really familiar as well. So there's some differences, but it's actually a lot less than you would think.
Thank you. Yeah. That's great. Somebody says anonymously, I posted some pictures on Facebook of the empty city during the first lockdown, and everyone thought it was 28 days later.
Wow.
There was a question, and maybe something that is of interest to everybody here. Although you have booked to come and join us in person, and thank you for doing so, you will receive a recording of this talk, so you can have a look at it again if it's of interest, and it will be available for at least a month, just so you know. We will be sending also the details about Lauren's work and a feedback request, which please, if you could fill out. It really is important for us to demonstrate that our program is meeting the aims of the library service. So somebody says, it's hard now to realize that Chelsea was once the heart of Bohemia, as it's pretty much the opposite now.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that's probably why there hasn't been a horror film in Chelsea since the 70s.
So cuddly, too nice.
There should be, though.
Felix says, there's a great scene in the British Museum in Night of the Demon, where Dana Andrews steals a page from a book on witchcraft.
It's a brilliant scene. For length, I had to cut out the reading room. There's a few great films, but Night of the Demon, as this person said, highly recommend. It's based, it was inspired by M.R. James' Casting the Runes. So if you're familiar with that, that's the basic idea. And Carswell and Dana Andrews' character sort of face off in the British Library reading room. You can't film there anymore. It's now an exhibition space, but it's very dramatic and fantastic. I can highly recommend it. Thank you, whoever mentioned that. I love that film. Well done, Felix.
Another chance here, or I have a lot of questions online. There you go, sir.
You alluded to, I'm looking to talk with William.
Oh.
You alluded to disused or railway line in the Death Line, in the museum station.
Yeah.
There's a rake of these disused stations.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't think they're used enough in movies or talked about enough. Why do you think that is?
It's a really interesting question. I think part of it is.
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, of course. Sorry. He was pointed out that there's disused British Museum station is mentioned in Deathline, but there are so many other disused stations in London, and he was wondering why it might not be used as much or why not be talked about it much. I definitely don't have the definitive answer. I will say that because I agree with you. It seems really confusing. I wouldn't be surprised if at least part of it has to do with TfL's image of the underground. Although there are these amazing horror films, when you get the books on the underground and movies filmed on the underground, They only mention one, if any, horror films, even though, as you've seen, there's dozens. So I think there's probably a certain amount of that. That being said, I do wonder if a part of it is we've become we lean into the fact that Aldwych Station, one of these disused stations, is used for filming a lot of these movies. And so I think in general, we probably just lean on, oh, Aldwych Station. We don't think about these other ones. If there's any filmmakers out there, though, this is a very good point. This is a very haunted space.
So I think that if we talk about technically and literally going to these places, and probably with TFL, it's a nightmare trying to get the kind of permissions to film in these things. So that's why they use Aldwych a lot, because it's literally set up to be the kind of so yeah. I mean, it's like the great thing is like Battersea Power Station has just been done up for years. That was just wonderful, great hulking shell. It was just, you know, you could literally hear the wolves howl around it in the park at night. It was just beautiful. The moon came up over it. And now you've got a whole other sort of setting there, because they've now completely redeveloped it and made it into another Westfield. And so you could just easily imagine another werewolf prowling around. There's so much to choose from in the Battersea Power Station there. There are gardens of all sorts of. I think it's just an evolving thing, isn't it? Hotlines and stuff.
No, I'm sure you're right. For those online, he was talking about how there's a lot of logistical problems to try and actually film at some of these disused stations, and that brought naturally to Battersea Power Station, which had been empty. It was in Children of Man, but I think totally underused for that big.
It's like it's on kind of, I can see it from the end of my road every morning. So
there you go.
It's a natural to
Yeah, it's another. There's so many. I think still so many spaces left in London that there should be. We've got so many more horror movies to come, I'm sure.
If I may, Mo is asking, he says, fascinating talk. Do you have a favorite horror subgenre, like vampires, mummies, monsters?
Oh, wow. There's a question. I have a serious soft spot for B horror movies. As bad as you can make them, I will eat it up. My brother recently recommended to me Santa's Sleigh. Oh my God, you have to really love a B horror movie, but it's awful in all the best ways. If some of you've been to my other talks, I'm always shoving Life Force in. Everyone who saw it at the time hated it, but it's such a great B movie. Soul-sucking spirit vampires. Like, how do you get better than that? So I'd say the B movie, which is a bit broad for a subgenre, but love them.
So Mickey says, what inspired you to go into such depth of this intriguing subject?
Oh, wow. The honest answer is I wanted to go on a London horror walk and no one did them. And I was like, oh, well, and my husband said, well, you should do it then. And at first I was like, yeah. But then I did. And I think it was just one of those things where once you start down the rabbit hole, you just keep going. Every new movie had such fascinating histories. And then I'd get introduced to the next movie and the next, and it just snowballed. Maybe it's just that I really love horror movies, that it was very easy to fall into it. But yeah, it's really, I don't know, it just came naturally.
So Mo says, do the parks get used often? Places like Hampstead Heath can be spooky at night.
That's really true. There's that I think Hampstead Heath is the one that's in Werewolf of London in the 30s, and it shows up in bits and pieces as well. More recently, it's in Bram Stoker's Dracula 1992 film. The Battersea Park is the one I think that really gets used to the best effect, but it was during the time when the Battersea Fun Fair existed. So there's a lot of films like I'm so sorry, I'm blanking on the Murders of the Black Museum, which has its climax at the Battersea Fun Fair. And in Gorgo, the little baby monster, is held at Battersea Fun Fair. So there's a lot of great ones there. And then, of course, if anybody's seen The Last Horror Movie, it's a very, very 90s movie. It really works when rentals existed as horror movies. But he does a lot of shot work in the smaller parks. But you're right. I mean, they have a great atmosphere, and I don't think we do as much the haunting side of it so much as just having some space to film. There's a lot in Hyde Park as well. There's some really great ones.
Mm-hmm. And what about Marylebone? JL wants to know. It has Sherlock Holmes
Mhm.
And it was an occult center of much activity from late 19th century onwards. So have you found,
Yeah, that's a great question. Weirdly, the occult side of it is definitely not as common in the horror movies, but there's a lot of great horror films that go through Marylebone. As you pointed out, there's a lot of Sherlock Holmes Ripper crossover films, so they use Baker Street and Marylebone area. Marylebone train station is in Day of the Triffids. If anyone knows it, there's that great train that's out of control because the conductor's blind and he crashes through Marylebone station. There's a few other sort of small moments going down Marylebone. And then, of course, the nearby Harley Street. All of our mad doctors live on Harley Street. I'm secretly hoping, if this book is of interest to people, that I can do volume 2. And then of my 20 walks, I can do a few more, because Marylebone's a walk I love to give. I still occasionally do that walk, and it's always so much fun because there's just so many different stories for that area.
well, Andy says there are some great London horror film walks. For example, a superb one based around Theatre of Blood, organized by the Vincent Price Legacy Group. Vincent Price being the
Yeah, he's the star of
Blood
Theater
Killer.
of Blood, if you guys don't know it. That's amazing. I have no idea why I didn't find it. This would have been 2016 when I started doing this, so I'm not sure why I didn't find it, but thank you. And please go, if you don't know Theater of Blood, it's absolutely fantastically camp. It's not only does Vincent Price sell you that, but I mean, all of these people die in inspiration of Shakespearean plays. So watch the film and go on this walk. It's with the Vincent Price Society, he
Yes,
said. This
Legacy.
sounds amazing. I will go. Highly recommend, even though I haven't been on it, because who doesn't love Theater of Blood? Thank you. Thank you.
So we've come to the end of our time. So I'll finish just with one comment from Richard Shepherd, who said, "So great, thank you so much. And thank you for coming on my podcast to talk about Stephen King's Crouch End."
Oh my God, hi Richard. That was great fun as well. If you're into Stephen King, his podcast is amazing. We talked Crouch End and the short story there. And of course, there's some great horror films in Crouch End as well, not least Shaun of the Dead. It was a lot of fun. Thank you, Richard, for watching.
He did have a question.
Oh, great.
Films aside, what novels or short stories in the horror genre are set in London that you could recommend?
Oh, actually, the British Library just recently came out with a book that's called, it's something like London in the Fog or Shadows in the Fog, the Stories of London. And that has quite a good compilation of things. The Lodger, obviously Mary Belloc-Londis one is the short story she did before the novel is in there. And there's this is embarrassing. It's something like the Devil's Lover, or The Devil is Her Lover, is something like that title. I'm so sorry, I'm forgetting it. It's been a while since I read it, but it is in that British Library produced book. And then of course Peter Ackroyd did Limehouse Golem, which I really enjoyed, and I can definitely recommend if you haven't read it. Thanks.
So anybody else has a question? Yes.
Yeah, hi. Another thing we have a lot of in London, which are really great, is cemeteries. Really atmospheric cemeteries. The Magnificent Seven cemeteries and Highgate and Central Road and all those places. I can't recall how many years ago in movies.
Oh, excellent. So he's pointed out that we have some amazing cemeteries in London. He mentioned the Magnificent Seven, and he was wondering whether they were used in film. There are a ton of great movies around Highgate Cemetery that tend to be vampire movies. There's things like Body Beneath, which is Andy Milligan, and Taste the Blood of Dracula, those kind of things. And of course, Kensal Green Cemetery has some great ones. Theater of Blood, again, is in Kensal Green Cemetery, and so is Don't Close Your Eyes. And I think someone in the audience knows a few more.
No, you just did it.
Oh, I did it, apparently. But yes, so those two definitely make a good solid mark. There are more to be used. I really quite like as well I don't know how many people go to it, but the old Jewish cemetery is really atmospheric and overgrown, and that they haven't said anything there yet, and I really hope they do. But thank you.
Okay, so the last comment from Fiona Newton to say there are unusual stations in Glasgow. The underground there is known as the Clockwork Orange.
Oh.
So there you go. And
Thank you.
the last question we'll take for tonight from Andy. When will the book be available, please? He pre-ordered a copy about 3 months ago. Is that now?
Thank you
Even if-
so much, Andy. I'm very sorry to anybody who's pre-ordered the book. We had an issue with our publisher is in Europe, and with the conflict with Ukraine, there's been a delay. At the moment, we're pretty sure we'll be able to have the book out for the 18th of November, so it should be 2 more weeks. The press itself, if you ordered it from Strange Attractor Press, they'll get the book out slightly sooner, because when they get it, they'll send it to you and then onto the bookstores and places like Amazon. So you'll have a sort of closer to the 18th if you ordered it through one of those. But if you ordered it from the press, it would be sooner than that. And of course, I really appreciate you all doing this. Thank you. And I really appreciate your patience. I can't tell you enough. And for anybody who hasn't yet, this is probably cheeky of me. I'm not sure whether my press would be thrilled about that. But there's a sale on Forbidden Planet around Hollywood themed things. And so it's 20% off of my book right now, which is very exciting. Which still hasn't quite out yet, but there you go. Thank you, Andy. And anybody who's here as well, I have these little flyers because I was hoping to bring the book today, but obviously I wasn't able to. Thank you.
Thank you very much then.
Thanks.
Thank you all for coming. It's lovely to see real people.
Yeah.
I-